Moving on to this morning's first speaker, I think everyone in this room probably has some role in the joint planning process, which feeds into the regional water planning process. Those planning cycles just keep going and going. Every round, there's new considerations and new lessons. Our first speaker today has been and is deeply involved in the regional water planning process. So let's welcome Jason Afinowicz. I practiced that all morning. A principal and vice president at Freese and Nichols, who will be providing us with some insights on the groundwater and the regional planning process over the years.
Let's see. Clicker. Oh, is this it? Oh, perfect. I can work that one. It's big, it's green. If I miss that, there's something wrong. Good morning, everybody. I know I'm still getting up to speed. I think we're all absorbing our coffee this morning, getting going. So appreciate y'all being here today to kind of talk through this. A process that I've been involved in for about 20 years now, my whole career in water planning. So if you do that math, you realize that I was about 8 years old when I started doing this, and it kind of feels that way sometimes. We remember when we started this whole process years ago, and we would think, oh man, if we can just imagine getting to the 2016 plan or the 2021 plan, and here we are, we're looking toward 26. It just keeps going. But it's been an ongoing process with the planning group members, all the work that they've done, of course, the local sponsors, and certainly the Texas Water Development Board, who's been an incredible partner in making this process not only what it is right now, but what it's going to be in the future, and continuing to work with us on what that looks like in the future. So, start out, what do we really talk about in regional planning or water planning in general? The concern and our focus is how do we prepare for the future? And that can get harder and harder as time goes by. So what you see here gives you an idea of kind of where we've been as a state in this population growth curve, and that's been continuing over time. And if you look at the numbers from the last regional water plan, the last state water plan, that's not slowing down anytime soon. You see that trajectory that just kind of goes out there. And all these people they're being born in Texas, they're being raised in Texas, they're moving to Texas because it's a great place. How do we do the best we can to prepare for those future needs? And of course, with those people, they're not just going to be here and drink their bottled water they came in with. They're going to want water. And so one of the key resources we're looking for is how do we provide that long-term water supply for them. So all that population translates directly to a water demand as well that you see here. And might I add, this is just the population-related component of that. So this is the municipal demand, this is the steam electric demand, this is the manufacturing demand. What are we forgetting? We're forgetting the ag demand as well. So as you all very well know, that is a huge component of the overall water budget for the state. So we're talking about an awful lot of water from a number of different sources that we need to plan for and to take care for our future. So back in the day when Texas first started the planning process, right after the drought of the 50s, the Texas Water Development Board initiated a statewide planning process. It was done centrally from Austin in their agency. So they would plan for the needs of Texas across the state and what strategies may be needed to take care of those future demands. So this was what was considered a top-down process. Now, we did that kind of inconsistently from time to time, whenever we felt like it, whenever we had the funding to do a full state water plan, and we're able to produce 6 of those up until the late 90s. And in 1997, there was Senate Bill 1, which completely changed the way that Texas looked at planning for water. And suddenly, instead of going for that top-down process, we were talking about a bottom-up process, where we would look at the individual needs of regions and then roll that up into a statewide water plan. And so since that time, we've been doing that on a pretty regular basis and making it a priority for the state. So What that process basically consists of is breaking the state into 16 different planning regions. We all get a letter. Everybody gets a letter that denotes their region. Some have added names to that, but generally we've got letters across the state. And those generally follow basin lines with some political boundaries in there as well, just so we don't pull our hair out trying to track all the borders. But it's all run by volunteer planning groups. So these planning groups consist of people, usually about 20 to 30, somewhere in that range, depending on the size of the region. There are some stakeholder groups that are required by a Texas Water Development Board. On top of that, you've also got other special interests that the planning groups themselves have added. So it's a pretty diverse group of people. A lot of them have background in water, a lot of them don't. So you get a lot of different voices in that conversation. The plans are a 50-year planning horizon, so right now we're actually jumping ahead. We're looking out to 2080 in this upcoming round, for instance, and we'll look at that in 10-year snapshots along the way. And we do this every 5 years. People ask me why every 5 years. Once you see all the different assumptions and the uncertainties that go into this, you very quickly understand why it's important to not only have a plan, but keep it up to date. And so that's why that 5-year cycle. And then finally, once all those regions get done with their work, that's getting compiled into the statewide water plan. So again, starting at the regions and working up in that bottom-up process. So to summarize this is a terribly oversimplified explanation of what regional water planning is, but it hits those high points, the different components. One of them is the demands. How much water are we going to need? And of course, this involves the population projections and the demands associated with that. There are the water supplies, the existing water supplies as we consider them, and then it's kind of an accounting exercise. How do we identify where the gaps are between those two? And one thing that's really remarkable about the Texas process that I haven't really seen replicated elsewhere in other states that have statewide planning is the way that we do that at a water utility group level. So this is at a utility level as opposed to a basin level where a lot of states plan. In a lot of cases, they look at a county or a basin. They say, well, there's more supply here than there is demand, everything must be fine. The Texas process is very focused on what are the needs to make that water available to the users. And so that's what makes it so strong. So once those needs are identified, there's a whole process of going through strategies. How do we close those gaps identified there? And then finally getting to a plan that includes all that information. So in the past, the answer to the water security for Texas has been focused on one answer in a lot of ways. So following the drought of the 50s, Texas said, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to plan for our future. And that initiated a huge reservoir construction process that significantly increased the amount of surface water storage that we have across the state. And you see how that response curve looks like over time. There was an awful lot of development that, of course, has trailed off the past several decades as it's tapered out. And so this has given us a big resource that we're still capitalizing on today. It was a big investment back then, and now we're using it to our best to deal with the droughts that we contend with on a regular basis. But if you want to look at this a different way, I think an interesting way of thinking about it is what is the amount of reservoir storage we have per person. So think of this as your own per capita amount of reservoir storage, your X number of gallons that you have as a Texan. And if you look at how that balances out over time with the increase in population, we're really at about the same amount of surface water storage as we were at the beginning of the 1950s drought. So just let that sink in there for a little bit. From a water security standpoint, at least surface water security, we're at about that same point from a reservoir standpoint. Now, we do use water much more effectively now and more efficiently, but that is something to keep in mind. The answer for the future will involve all sorts of solutions, not just surface water, not just reservoirs, and of course, as you all well know, groundwater is a component of that. And if you look over the projections for the regional plan, groundwater is expected to be about 50% of the overall available water supply. And this is what's considered existing water supplies in the plan, so without the addition of new projects. So that's a significant component, as y'all know. So it's a massive resource that y'all manage and y'all work toward in providing for water for the state. Of course, if you look across Texas, that really varies in just how much water is used where. So the darker areas there, I don't think any of those will surprise you. That's where groundwater is a larger portion of the budget. In other areas, you've got a much smaller, less significant portion of groundwater supply. But you can rest assured, even if you are in one of those regions that typically hasn't used groundwater to a great degree, that focus is only going to increase over time as scarcity increases and people are more interested in looking at all their different options for water supply. So a little graphic that I love here. This is actually in the back of the state water plan. I don't know why it's in the back. I wish they'd move it to the front. But if you go to your most recent state water plan, there's this lovely graphic that walks through the whole planning process for Texas. And this is just a section that talks about everything since Senate Bill 1. And pointing out there in 2005, the beginning of the joint planning process that y'all work in and how that feeds into the overall state water plan. And so this was a great step in allowing groundwater to be better represented in the regional water plans, as well as having its own planning process for a number of reasons. So I think most of y'all are fairly familiar with that, and I know some of y'all may work in it to differing degrees, but similar sort of situation. You have the state broken into 16 GMAs, and ever since 2011, those GMAs have also included representation on the regional water planning groups, which officially formalizes that relationship. That was a great move. And as y'all know, going through the joint planning process, it's a series of looking at the available information that's there, proposing DFCs, going through a public process, adopting those DFCs, which ultimately get translated into modeled available groundwater, which can then be used for a number of different planning purposes. And that's one of the key things that feeds directly into regional and state planning, those MAGs. Those are so important for our water supplies. And so if we talk about how groundwater has been represented in the plans, it's kind of evolved over time. And I kind of break into 3 different phases. One of those is in the first couple rounds of planning, what I consider regional planning group driven availability. And so when we were starting out in regional planning, we didn't have anything to work on. We had a few years to turn around a state plan. Anybody who's seen the recent state flood plan has seen what this process is like, trying to get something off the ground from nothing. So there was a lot of existing information that was used, available reports, other scientific studies that were published out there to try to gather what availability was. But ultimately, those groundwater availability numbers were subject to the whim of the regional planning group at the time. So you have regional planning groups that were setting, hopefully with cooperation with y'all, setting what that availability was in their plans. And so that worked for the first couple of rounds just to get us by, but then that had to evolve over time. And that evolution, of course, was the development of the joint planning process, DFCs, and MAG. So overlaying the state, the planning groups, and the GMAs, you started to get to a point where you could translate that process that's coming out of joint planning, put that directly into the regional and state plans. And so that third round, that 2011-2012 round, was technically the first round that actually used the MAG, or could use the MAGs as their availability. At that point, the GMAs had to get their DFCs in by January 1st of 2008. Now only GMAs 8 and 9 pulled that off, so good job 8 and 9. For the rest of us, we kind of picked that process up in the next cycle. In 2016 and 2017. But you see where that joint planning process is tied in with the schedule of the regional plans as well. The last, I think, big change that really helped coordinate these 2 different processes is the addition of MAG peaking factors. And if y'all are involved in the regional planning process, y'all have heard about these, or if not, you may have your regional planning groups reaching out to y'all about them. But this kind of addresses the way that these 2 planning processes are geared in different ways. One of those, if you look at joint planning, what you're really thinking about, you're modeling a long-term, typically an average pumping condition. Obviously, those can change as y'all vary in the modeling. But what you're looking at is a long-term 50-year, where does this put me in my DFC 50 years out? Now, when we talk about regional water planning is really only focused on the drought, the repeat of the drought of record, meaning a one-year drought that is the drought of record for any particular basin. So what we're looking at there is we're looking at a demand condition that may be a good bit higher than what it is typically. Now, these don't necessarily align depending on the way that you manage water in your own districts. So think of it this way. If you have a peak that is greater than your average that may exceed your MAG, that may not necessarily be an issue. Y'all may still be able to manage and reach your DFC despite that. And what the MAG peaking factor allows for is the flexibility to translate those long-term average groundwater supplies to a short-term peak groundwater demand. So MAG peaking factors help bring some reality and more flexibility in how we work with y'all's management rules in the regional planning process. So there's still a fair number of opportunities that we can capitalize on, plan for in the future as we continue to evolve this process and make it better and better, and how groundwater and surface water are both planned for. One of those things, maybe this is just something to keep in mind as y'all are going through joint planning, is how the availability in what I would consider non-traditional formations is considered. And so this comes from the guidance for regional water planning, which states, for groundwater sources where no DFC exists, regional planning groups may determine the groundwater availability for planning purposes. So what this relates to is it relates to situations where, as y'all go through joint planning, you consider something non-relevant for planning purposes. And I know that there are certain priorities, certain formations, certain aquifers are your biggest priorities that you're planning for, but just also keep in mind for all those that you're submitting as not relevant for planning, that's also giving the planning groups pretty much free rein to kind of change how they set up those availabilities. It's kind of like it was in the initial process. So just something to be aware of, work with your planning groups, work through the process as you can to make sure that your understanding of availability is transferred into those regional water plans. This is a interesting little equation. I like talking to a group like this. I can throw out a whole bunch of acronyms and symbols, and I think y'all can generally understand where I'm headed with this whole thing. You take GAMs, you put the GMAs, work with those. That creates DFCs. Those DFCs relate to MAGs. The MAGs go into the state water plan, and the state water plan equals money. Because on the back end of the state water plan is all of the Water Development Board funding that's tied to that. So the important thing about this, I think, is keeping in mind if we're looking at what our state needs are for infrastructure on the back end of this, we have to also keep in mind what's going in and feeding the process from the front end. And so that's why it's incredibly essential that we continue funding not just the GAM updates and programs, but also all data collection and science. I know Water Development Board is continuously working with the resources that they have to bring y'all the best information, because it's absolutely true. The better information y'all have, the better decisions you make, the better the process is overall. Also, how we look at distributions of groundwater in the planning process. In a lot of cases, what the planning groups get from Water Development Board are just focused on county and basin splits of groundwater, which isn't always adequate to really address our needs. So to give you an example of that, here's a case, our favorite county, Big Thirsty County. They happen to have a water user group there, the city of Grow Fast, our favorite town, of course. And Grow Fast is growing fast. They're living up to their namesake there. And they have a future water demand of 100 acre-feet that they're trying to plan for. Now, the good thing about it is if you look at the MAG for Big Thirsty County, there's a 1 bajillion acre-feet per year MAG for Big Thirsty County from the magic aquifer. So we're very thankful to have that magic aquifer there. And so you'd think this would be an easy exercise. The county has this much availability. We can assign that to the WUG. Everything's fine. We know it doesn't work that way, right? So if you actually look at the extent of the magic aquifer, it doesn't exactly line up. Now, there's this nice little pod over there that does coincide with Grow Fast, but that's great. But if you start to dig into what's actually represented in the pumping grid from the models, from the MAG run, you're only getting about 10 acre feet from there. That's not enough. That majority of that bajillion acre feet you need really across the county. So depending on where you are and depending on the aquifers that you're looking at in each county, the planning groups may have to do an awful lot of work to really get to what some of this information is and where these water supplies are located. So that, I think, needs to be a much larger consideration in the way that we look at funding for regional plans, because there is an awful lot of focus on this in a lot of regions that do have to pay attention to it, and that's not always accounted for. So this is another situation where, again, y'all's cooperation with the planning groups is greatly appreciated. I can't thank you enough for that in working with us as we go through these things. And then finally, groundwater and surface water. So I have to say I'm very lucky. My children play well together. They're very nice. They get along well. But you know what? I can always guarantee they'll get along really well if they're separate. And it's kind of like that same way for groundwater and surface water too. You kind of got different constructs on the legal perspective for each of those. You've got different ways that they're planned for. And when they're separate, they all play nicely. When there are overlaps in that, and as there will be more and more in the future, there will be more challenges and harder decisions we're going to have to work through. So just case in point here that has really come up in the Brazos G region and Region H along the Brazos. You have the Brazos River alluvium there, which historically over time has been a supply for agriculture, and I can't stress enough, that's not the concern here at all, is that historical use for ag. The risk, though, and what has some people worried up and down the basin is how future growth in this highly developing, very rapid, almost grow fast WUG sort of growth area of Texas, how are they going to meet their future water supply needs? And are they going to turn to the easy solution of an aquifer that's right there that may have interactions with the surface water as well? So they may be solving a near-term water supply issue, but possibly creating a much bigger issue up and down the basin. So this is going to take cooperation on both sides to work together and deal with these issues as they come up. This is just one example, but it definitely highlights the importance of having the surface water and the groundwater sides working together. And that's another reason I'm so glad that the GMAs have representation on the planning groups. So where we're going from here, we're launched into this process for the 2026 plan. And so right now where we stand, working through several near-term objectives, and a couple of these are very important to y'all and directly involved what y'all are doing from a groundwater management perspective. As we're finishing up demands, we're also looking towards supplies, surface water and groundwater. So those factors of mag peaking factors, availability of those non-traditional formations, we'll be coming to y'all as districts and GMAs to work through some of those issues in the upcoming months. After that, starting to do that math, do the accounting, figure out where the water needs are, and then it's water management strategies. That's really the meat of the regional planning process, getting down to what are the future infrastructure needs for Texas. And so this is another place, as we look toward those alternative water supplies and new things that haven't been utilized in the past, how can we responsibly use groundwater to meet some of those growing needs? And that gives you a highlight. This is the most misleading timeline there is. It's accurate, but what I always like thinking about when I see this is, yeah, we're halfway through the process, but we are just getting into the busy half of the process. So things will be busy for the next couple years as we start to wrap up the regional plans across the state. And that's all I had for y'all today, but definitely want to answer any questions you had. Hopefully this was helpful to kind of bridge the two different sides of water planning in the state.
That was great. Thank you so much, Jason. We do have some time for questions.
Thanks, Jason. I just have a question for you about the timing of the regional water planning process. So let me give you an example. GMA 13, last year, they were presented with a water strategy right at the end of their planning process, and it didn't make it into the DFCs and the MAG for GMA 13. And so therefore, it doesn't make it into the Region M water plan now. Mm-hmm. So for this particular groundwater project to get state funding, it would essentially take 2 cycles for it to work through the process. Is there any way that we can do something different to speed that up?
that is absolutely perfect, because I was going to put that on there as another one of those things of how do we make this better? How do we do it? And I started pulling my hair out trying to think of how we would, and I don't honestly know if there is in a lot of ways. I think remaining flexible is, of course, very helpful, and that's, the board has been good about working with us on getting strategies in when we have to do amendments, things like that, and I appreciate it. But it's almost impossible, I think, to get everything timed just right. I sat down and thought about how can we time this a little bit better to account for some of those things, and it really is truly difficult to do it. So I think we're always going to end up in those gaps. Stressing the importance of the amendment process and making that more accessible, I think, is key. We need a plan that is strong enough to bend, and that's just another example of that.
So just to follow up on that, the amendment process is great, but it's also expensive for the client. So avoiding that expense is something that might be a good idea. How about staggering the time frame of the regional water planning process and the DFC process? Would that help?
The way that, if you look at the gaps on each side, when you slide that one way or the other, I don't know if there's an awful lot of space there, because we're just looking at, once the board had time to go through and update the mags, getting those out, there was only a fair amount of time until we started working with those, trying to evaluate what future supplies would be. So it's a tough problem, and I don't know if there is a perfect solution to it, unfortunately.
I did have a question come in on the app that I'll read out for you, Jason. How does the GMA evaluate and plan on aquifer availability for areas not covered by GCDs?
So the way that some of those areas are handled, those are kind of outside of that realm. That's always been a struggle, because you've got areas that fall outside of the GCDs. And it's back to that focus on local control, and that's one of the strengths of the GCD process and the GCD structure, but it's also one of the shortcomings too, and not being able to account for some of those areas. I know the GMAs that I've had the privilege to work with have struggled to get representation of any sort, even in those areas where there aren't even districts available, if there were just somebody who would want to represent the groundwater interests. And that's an awful tough challenge. And so I don't know if I have an answer to that either, but no, that's absolutely a concern.
Thank you for that. Any other questions in the audience? All right, let's give Jason a round of applause. Thank you so much for being here, Jason.